to Hence the Future podcast. I'm Mattimore Cronin,
And I'm Justin Clark.
and today we're discussing the future of philosophy. But before we get into what the predominant philosophies are and how we predict these philosophies are going to evolve in America and across the world going forward, I thought it would be awesome if we first started out with the 8 great philosophical questions. And Justin and I can each give our take on those questions. And some of them are quite a doozy, so here they are. Question 1. Why is there something rather than nothing? In other words, we know that the Big Bang existed, at least most people agree on that fact. Why was there a Big Bang? Why not just no Big Bang at all? And hold your answer because I'm just going to list out the questions first. The second one, is our universe real? Third, do we have free will? Fourth, does God exist? Is there life after death? And then, what is the best moral system? And can you really experience anything objectively? And then I guess part 2 of that last question, which is related, is what are numbers? So these are going to be the 8 questions that we're going to discuss right now. Justin and I have not discussed any of these with each other previously. I mean, we've probably touched on some of them, like free will and religion. But anyways, let's start with the first one. So why is there something rather than nothing? Why was there a Big Bang instead of no Big Bang at all? Why is there anything in this universe? So Justin, I'll let you start out on that.
Okay. I think the question itself is it has a lot of assumptions behind it because it assumes that we have some sort of understanding of the nature of reality. And in my opinion, we don't know, we think we know something about reality. I think that we know vastly less than we think we know about reality. And I don't think a lot of people really understand the Big Bang, but there's just so much physical evidence pointing to something like a Big Bang. So if you have of these models and this math that kind of describes the nature of reality and how it's progressed through time, or the nature of the cosmos, working our way back from that, it inevitably leads to what we would consider the Big Bang. But that doesn't, it's really hard to wrap my mind around
Yeah,
there being nothing.
I kind of think I know what you're getting at, which is that the Big Bang is a really attractive idea, and there's a lot of evidence for it because it's like, oh, the Big Bang, that's when it all happened. And God said,
Hmm.
let there be light, and then it just happened right then. That's the starting point. But to choose any starting point is very arbitrary because there's so much at play. Like take, one example that Alan Watts gives is when is a baby conceived? Was the baby conceived the moment that the sperm fertilized the egg? Or was the baby conceived the moment that the mother and father fell in love with each other? Or maybe the moment that the mother and father met each other? Or maybe the moment that either the mother or father was born? Or maybe you can bring it all the way back to Adam and Eve, or whoever the first like real humans were that evolved from apes.
Or
And
even further,
or even
the
further,
the
you can,
beginning of the
yeah,
universe.
all the way back to the Big
If
Bang. So really, any starting point is very arbitrary. The other thing that
And
I'll,
that'll tie into our free will question
yeah,
probably as well.
definitely. The other thing that I'll say is that I agree that I think the question is a bit misguided, misconstrued, because to say why is there something rather than nothing, for there to be nothing in the universe, nothing only exists as a word in contrast to something. So you can't say like, oh, if there's a nothing universe, then there's nothing to be experienced. There's no consciousness. So there isn't even any term of nothing that could apply to it because there's no beings to experience it. Similar to
Hmm.
like the if a tree falls in the woods and no one's around to hear it sort of thing.
Right.
So yeah, so the universe just is it would be my answer. There's no why. The
Hmm.
universe just is. There is this great cosmic dance that's going on, and to put any why to that or to put any first cause would be an inadequate mapping of our monkey brains onto something that's so much more complex than that.
Yeah, because there might not even be, in the true universe, the
Yeah.
the the overall universe that we know nothing about, there might be no such thing as a beginning.
Right. Well, because we experience the arrow of time. That's something physicists talk about all the time. Stephen Hawking talks a lot
Hmm.
about it, where we can go forward. In fact, we have no choice but to keep going forward with time. We cannot go back. We cannot go side to side with different parallel universes. We are always marching forward. But there's no reason to think that that would exist for all conscious beings everywhere in the cosmos. In the same way that we can go backwards and forward and side to side in 3D space, it's quite conceivable, and there's lots of mathematical and scientific evidence that other higher beings in higher dimensions, you would be able to go in any direction within time. So I think that kind of obliterates the whole idea of there being any starting point for anything. Um,
Hmm. Yeah, and I think we've talked about this before, but this is one of the theories I have about what the Big Bang actually is. So if you think about our fabric of the cosmos, or what we experience, it seems like it's 3D. But if you think about what a four-dimensional object interacting with a three-dimensional object is. So for example, take a sphere, a four-dimensional sphere interacting with three dimensions. If that sphere starts in the fourth dimension, but it's not touching the three-dimensional fabric, nothing is there. Then once that four-dimensional sphere comes into contact with our three-dimensional world, it just appears out of nowhere, seemingly out of nowhere, as a super tiny point. And then as it continues into our three-dimensional space, it looks like it's just a sphere that gets bigger and bigger and bigger until the midpoint at the biggest part of the sphere, and then it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So, from our perspective, it looks like something just came out of nowhere, and then it disappears eventually. So one of the things I have a fun time thinking about is what that actually could mean for us. You know, what that is actually the bang. Something like that is what the Big Bang is. Just a higher dimensional object coming into contact with a lower dimensional space of some sort.
Right, and I think from our observations in quantum physics, there are a lot of things that we can't explain, and that might be because we're butting up against a higher dimensionality reality that we
Hmm.
can't conceive of. And we should talk more about that in some of the later questions, especially around what are numbers and can you really experience anything objectively. So I want to save some of that discussion.
Hmm.
But let's go on to the next one. So the next
Okay.
one is, so is our universe real?
Yeah. So again, I think this depends on what the true definition of real is.
Yeah.
I mean, that'll get into another question, can we experience anything objectively? I don't
Right.
know.
Yeah, these questions all sort of weave together.
But from the subjective experience, yeah, I mean, the universe definitely seems real, even if we're in a simulation. It seems real to me.
Yeah. I think what I would say on that question is that it is as real is to us. I mean, that's why we created the world. So I agree with you there. As far as is it real in the highest objective sense, I think it's helpful to look at other animals and what their reality is and how that's different from our reality. Like, for instance, what is it like to be a bat who echolocates? Or what is it like to be a dog that sees in black and white but that has incredible sense of smell? What is it like to be all of these animals, like an orca, for instance, that has an entire part of its brain that we don't have dedicated to emotional communication? And it's probably very different than what it's like to be us. And to a lesser degree, there are differences from one human to the next. So what it's like to be me is different than what it's like to be Justin, is different than what it's like to be Roseanne Barr, is different than what it's like to be Joe Rogan or whoever.
Hmm.
So I think when we talk about what is real, there's personal reality, and then there's also the collective reality, which is where realities overlap. And I think that's more of what people talk about in scientific circles, where it's like, well, is this real? Does it withstand the test of science and the scientific method? And even that is very hard to get at. So maybe we should just jump into, can you really experience anything objectively? Because I think that they're too similar to not talk about one after the other.
Okay.
But that, I think, can we experience anything objectively is what you were saying earlier, where we can only experience reality or objectively as far as we can perceive through our senses with the resolution that we can. So the
Hmm.
certain wavelengths that we can see, the certain wavelengths that we can hear, the different smells that we can smell, we're limited to those degrees, and we're limited to all the dimensions that we don't even have an inkling of.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I would pretty much agree completely because I think we can approximate objectivity, but I don't think, given the narrow band of what we can actually experience, I don't think it's, I don't think we can actually get that close in a lot of cases. But there are some idealized cases, that are very specific to, I don't know, numbers. Can we experience what two is? Can we experience what three is? We have a pretty objective sense of what those things are when you look at it rigorously.
Well, I'm
And
not so sure though. I mean, I want to get into numbers as the next one, but just to close the loop on this, can we experience anything objectively? I feel like the answer is no, simply.
Mhm.
Because, again, going back to quantum mechanics, when we keep cutting things down to smaller and smaller degrees, there's the famous double slit experiment, which is that when someone is observing these atoms going through this slit, these two slits, it appears as atoms, or it appears as particles.
Particle, yeah.
Whereas when someone is not actively looking at it, it appears as waves. So
And to add a little bit to that, it's not somebody looking at it, it's
the
trying
measurement
to
device.
measure what, like, the momentum or the position of this particle, because
Right.
there's a trade-off in how accurately you can figure out where the particle is, or what the momentum of this part. So even if we're looking at it, it doesn't change. But, well, okay, I guess it does, because if we're looking at it, then the photons are bouncing off of that, and then it collapses the wave
Yeah, I mean,
function. I think that's too.
anyone who's listening to this should just YouTube double slit experiment and watch the video because it's really difficult to explain. But the point of the matter is that it appears that by observing a phenomenon, you change the phenomenon itself. So that, I believe, is proof that nothing is totally objective. There's not us and then the objective universe. It's this dance and this interplay of all of the conscious beings observing everything and all of the what we would call inorganic or non-conscious beings that are also part of the interplay. So to say that anything's objective would, I think, go against Einstein's theory of relativity and what we've discovered in quantum mechanics as well. So I would just say, no, there is nothing we can experience objectively, but the closest we can get is through science and through numbers.
Yeah,
And
I'll add a little bit there. I think there are some things that we can't experience objectively, like some sort of quantum effects. There are definitely some things that we just can't wrap our heads around, and we can't actually know, we can't know again, the position and the momentum of a particle with
well, so
100%
what could we
certainty.
experience objectively then?
Well, we can experience, kind of like I was saying, we can experience the number two. We can experience the well, I was going to say temperature, but there's a lot of nuances to temperature because that's temperature is like the emergent
Right.
property of a bunch of particles moving quickly or slowly. But I think there are some things that we
Yeah.
can
So let's,
experience objectively because we have a rigorous definition of some things.
yeah. So that leads to the numbers question. So I agree with you that if anything, if there's anything we can experience objectively, numbers are it. Like for instance, like if you're watching the video now, how many fingers am I holding up?
3.
So would you say that three is a part of this video image that you're looking at?
So I have some thoughts about it. I think 3 is a nice abstraction to things that happen in
Right.
reality. Because 3, having 3 fingers up doesn't necessarily add, the property 3 to the video. Um, I don't think that. I
Yeah, I
mean,
guess
this among.
so I guess the point that I'm getting
What were you
at
saying?
is in metaphysics there seems to be really two camps as far as the philosophy of numbers. One camp is
Hmm.
the Platonic camp, which is what Plato purported to be true, which is that it's not just that we conceptualize numbers, it's that numbers very much do exist in some higher dimensional version of the universe in some truly objective way. The other camp is the conceptual camp, which is that numbers are just concepts that are very useful to us. So, in the concept of three, having 3 fingers is more of a useful concept. And I think for most people, it helps explain the overlap of rationality that humans experience
Hmm.
and whether or not it exists. So I tend to be a little bit more in the conceptual camp. However, I also think that, well, I'm not sure actually. I mean, it's very hard to say because I think numbers really, what they're getting at is they're helping to explain how the mind works, specifically the reason function of the mind. And then to go further, because the mind is created by nature, created by the workings of the universe, I think it can also help explain the workings of nature or the workings of the universe. So,
Hmm.
as far as rationality spreads, and we don't know how far that spreads to other species, but with humans, it has been one of the single greatest drivers of our progress as a species. And I think that it's in itself speaks to how powerful numbers are and how powerful rationality is. And when you're trying to explain the workings of the universe, numbers do the best job because that is common. Like we can all agree, every what we would call a sane person would agree that I was holding up 3 fingers a while ago. There are insane people who would argue that they just cannot comprehend the idea of numbers. But for all sane people, that is the anchor that holds us all together in the most fundamental sense.
Yeah, it does. The nice thing, like you said, it explains such a wide variety of phenomena, just things that happen in nature. And you can extend numbers to a whole bunch of other systems. So, just as a brief overview, you've got the natural numbers, which is like the counting numbers,
Hmm.
one, two, three, four. And then an extension of that is the integers, which includes zero and negative numbers. And then you have an extension of that, which is rational numbers, which are just fractions. So
Hmm.
any number that can be expressed as a fraction. And then you have real numbers, which is the real number line where, you learned in school where there's an infinite number of real numbers between 0 and 1.
Hmm.
It's a very large set of numbers.
1.11, 1.12, 1. Yeah.
Yeah,
But as much
forever.
as, yeah, exactly.
And then you can even the one of the things I find really interesting too is the numbers just keep extending. So one of the number systems that's very good at explaining a lot of things in nature are the complex numbers. And
Hmm.
I think these are unfortunately taught in school, and that there's imaginary numbers, which
Like
is the
E.
most unfortunate name they could have possibly had. Yeah, well, E is just a number. So square root of -1 is I, um, which doesn't make sense in the real numbers because there's no definition of square root of a
Yeah.
negative number. But so if you think of the real numbers as just a line, a single line, you
Hmm.
can think of complex numbers as a plane, so a two-dimensional number system.
In
Um,
other words, the upside down from Stranger Things.
I guess so, yeah. Um, but yeah, there's a lot of really cool things that you can do with these more and more complicated versions of numbers.
So
You
what's
know,
what's the use of having imaginary numbers? That's something I've never understood. I get the concept.
okay, let's talk about something that we see every single day. So we're on Skype right now, and if you've ever heard of something called a Fourier transform,
Yeah.
which basically is what converts, you can go between a frequency to a like from a whole bunch of different frequencies over time to just some well, so there's a lot of complications to this, but basically the most concise way to put this is you can change from the time domain. So think of the x-axis as time to the
Oh.
frequency domain, where you think of the x-axis as frequency.
Hmm.
So everything that's happening right now over Skype is using the Fourier transform. Anything involving signals. The entire basis of like signal processing has to do with the Fourier transform.
Hmm.
And I'm harping on the Fourier transform because in the equation is I, and it's very nicely visualized if you think of a two-dimensional number system. And when you have I, or e to the I, which is just a number raised to the I, you can visualize that as rotations around a circle. And then, there's a lot of complicated geometry behind this. I would recommend listeners go to the Three Blue, One Brown YouTube channel. He is an awesome math educator on YouTube, and there's a whole geometric or visualization of the Fourier transform. Highly recommended. I think it's
Yeah.
beautiful.
I mean,
Um,
I think what's so invaluable to me about numbers is that we can understand the basics of numbers pretty easily. I mean, you can get a second grader and they can understand, oh, 2 plus 2 equals 4. You have two crayons that are red, you have two crayons that are blue, and then you have four crayons at the end. And you can extend that out, make it a little bit more complex. You can introduce algebra, you can introduce other things that still
mhm.
pretty much make sense. And then just by extrapolating the principles of mathematics, you can bring it beyond what is comprehensible for us. I mean, we're it's the field is always expanding of what we can comprehend because we're having we're creating better ways of visualizing the data, which I think is really important for like topographical mapping, for instance, and those
Yeah.
sorts of things. But the cool thing about math is that even those very, very complex, more advanced, um, you know, mathematics still are anchored by the fundamental principles. And if you believe in the fundamental principles, and if you can believe and understand what's happening in the more basic levels, then it can help describe what is even beyond what you could comprehend.
Yeah, and one thing to add there is you don't have to, this is one thing that's so beautiful about math. You don't have to believe in math. Now, back in the early days of math, you did kind of have to believe in math. That's when
Hmm.
there was a lot of intuition-based
Like
proofs, which weren't
geometry was
necessary.
huge during Da
Yeah.
Vinci's day.
Yeah, and then you would have these proofs that were based on intuition rather than rigor and
Mm.
logic. And this led to some paradoxes, specifically in calculus, I believe, because there's a lot of counterintuitive properties of infinity, and calculus was kind of the
Hmm.
one of the first major branches of math where infinity was absolutely crucial, like taking an infinite sum or um, an infinitesimally small point on a curve,
Right.
for these for these different things in calculus. Um, but the nice thing now is it's rigorous. And
Hmm.
there was a push, I believe, in the late 19th century, like late 1800s, where mathematicians were pushed to be as rigorous as possible. And if they weren't rigorous and held up through the test of time and through all these peer reviews, that the doesn't hold in reality and it isn't true. So that's one of the things I really like about math is just how rigorous it is, at least
Yeah.
now.
And would you agree, going back to the original question of what are numbers, what is math, do you agree that what numbers are and what math is a way for describing the rationality of the human mind and by extension the rationality of the workings of nature and of the universe?
Yeah, I would say that it's very similar to that. I wouldn't say that it's necessarily for describing the human mind, but I would say that it's a nice abstraction that it doesn't so this will let me just go on a little soapbox for a second. So there's there's pure math and then there's applied math. And I think pure math is just purely based on the question of what is true. And it doesn't necessarily have to have any sort of grounding in reality or our experience of reality. No
Mm-hmm.
apparent application of these pure mathematical concepts. And there have been countless examples of how this totally pure math, no application, later on, maybe centuries later, became it became one of the more important things in applied math. So
Mm.
there's not necessarily a reason for it. There's not necessarily a it's not crucial to understand math,
But what
but what
is
it
it, I
does do.
guess?
So I think it's just an abstraction that we have, like that humans have created. Or if,
But there are
well,
lots of
I don't know
abstractions,
if
and,
we
and I
created
feel
it
like
or if we
it's
discovered it.
there are lots of abstractions, and I feel like mathematics is the most important or real or most anchoring of those abstractions. So it is
Hmm.
difficult to define, but I feel like to me, whenever I think of what it is, I think of two words that come to mind are reason and objectivity. even though we sort of demolished those with some of the previous questions, I feel like what we mean by reason and what we mean by objectivity is described even better than anything else by numbers and by mathematics.
Hmm.
And
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that.
yeah. Okay, well, I want to save some time for the other questions too. I mean, we could talk about numbers and debate this for multiple podcasts, but
Right.
so the last three questions that we have: do we have free will? Does God exist? Is there life after death? Sorry, it's four questions. And then the final one is, what is the best moral system? So let's talk about free will first. So it certainly appears that we have free will to most people. So, for instance, I'll give an example just from 2 nights ago. I haven't told you this story, but so 2 nights ago I went to a concert, Mother's concert. This very cool indie sort of punk band, but pretty mellow also. It's whatever. And I was there with my brother, and at one point in the concert, I look back, I hear a sound, and I look back, and my brother fainted. And I go and I pick him up, and everyone was sort of looking at us, concerned. Oh, what happened? Wasn't a big deal. He ended up just being dehydrated. But we start, the bouncer comes over. He starts like saying, "Oh, are you guys okay? Need water?" We're sort of going out of there, and I left my credit card at the bar. So now I have to figure out, do I cancel my credit card, whatever. So the question that I'd like to pose is, did I have the free will to have remembered and gotten my credit card? Because I think anyone can relate to the fact of, once I realized I left my credit card there with the tab open, I was like, oh, how could I be so stupid? I've left my card open. It's all the way in downtown LA. Now I got to go all the way back there. Why couldn't I just have thought and remembered to get my credit card?
Hmm.
And people, and that implies that I could have done differently, that there is free will. But I think I mean, I tend to agree with Sam Harris's take on this to a great extent. I don't agree 100% with what he says, and we can talk about that after, but he basically says that you could not have done any differently. Given all of the circumstances that you had, the fact that there was something that required your attention right at that moment. My brother had fainted. I had to deal with that. The fact that everyone was looking at us, that also had an impact. The fact that the bouncer was sort of giving us water and ushering us to the back, that if I ran the clock back, there's no other way that that would have occurred given all of those circumstances and given what my mind perceived to be the most important thing to focus on that time. My credit card, the thought of my credit card never arose, and the idea that you can think a thought before you think it, that you can make a thought arise out of
Hmm.
sheer, like, just out of your own whim, is an illusion. You cannot choose what comes to the top of your mind. You cannot choose what your thoughts are in any given moment. All you can do is respond to the given circumstances in the everlasting present based on your own brain, which you didn't pick, your own life experiences, which you didn't pick, your DNA, genetic composition, which you certainly didn't pick. And if you try to describe, like, what is the freedom, like, what's the free will, the sliver gets smaller and smaller until it disappears into basically nothingness that is free.
Yeah, I mean, I basically agree with that, and I even sometimes take this to an even greater extreme when I'm thinking about it, because let's just go to the classical interpretation of the Big Bang. There was a giant explosion, and then there were a whole bunch of particles that extended throughout, some sort of space-time fabric. Now, did the Big Bang just determine every single possible outcome of the future, including our own thoughts, including everything? So if we had a big enough supercomputer, would it be possible to, if we had the exact replication of the Big Bang, would we be able to simulate a reality similar to our own if we had a big enough computer? And would that reality be different? Is there's a lot of questions that come up from this. Is there like if you have the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics,
Yeah.
are does this Big Bang create an infinite number of realities where each one of those realities is its own timeline with no such thing as free will because everything has been determined by the state of particles from everything beforehand.
Right.
So I think
Yeah,
it's a
it's
really complicated question.
right. And I think that's one of the tricky things to square is the many worlds theory with there not being free will. So it seems like I believe that and the other question that I think is really interesting, which I've actually been meaning to ask Sam Harris in the Q&A on his
Oh
website,
yeah.
is if there is no free will, why does it appear that we have free will? Why is this phenomenon of feeling like there is freedom so prevalent? And I feel like part of it might be that we are sensing the other universes that do exist on the conscious plane, even if we could not have chosen one of those other parallel universes. So basically, it's easy for me to imagine a universe where I did at the last minute say, oh, you know what, my credit card's at the bar. Hold on 1 minute, I'm just going to go get it. It's super easy to imagine that. And that's why so many people play the lottery and waste money, is because it's so easy to imagine a universe where they're the ones that win. And if you believe in the many worlds theory, then there is a universe where you won the lottery. And so it's difficult for me to square that. So it's like, okay, either it is entirely deterministic, like Sam Harris says, where you could not have done otherwise based on all of the actions of all the beings. It always would have gone in this one direction,
Hmm.
which is sort of like the model that you were just talking about. If you were to build a model of the universe based on how computers work, it seems like it would just always have the same one, unless you introduced an element of randomness into the equation. So that would be the other explanation, which is the universe is simply random, where at any given time, because of, as represented by the double split experiment or, quantum physics, at any given time, some whim that comes out of seemingly nowhere that is truly random makes you decide to do one thing versus another. And so that is how the multiverse is created, by that sort of random effect that sort of burgeons into different forking paths.
Yeah, and so part of this depends on what your definition of randomness is, because
Yeah.
sometimes there's a version of randomness or probability where it's not actually in the pure objective sense, it's not. So as a quick example, let's say you're told to choose between three doors,
Hmm.
and one of them has $1 million, two of them are empty, or
Like
something else.
Schrodinger's cat is, same sort of example.
Yeah, and so in the pure objective sense, there is already that where that $1 million or the cat is alive or dead, that's already determined. You just don't know what it is yet.
Right.
So then you assign a probability. So without knowing where that door or where the $1 million is, your probability of getting the $1 million is 1/3, and
Hmm.
then your probability of not is 2/3. And same thing with the cat. The probability that it's alive from your perspective is 50%. The probability of it being dead from your perspective is also 50%. But is is there some sort of way to get to the actual objective?
Right. Well,
Is
it does seem like probability is the better way to describe the universe. It seems
oh yeah,
like
it definitely
through
is.
quantum computers are better at describing certain phenomena than traditional computers where the $1 million door was always there. It always, it couldn't have happened any other way. When we use probabilities, it tends to be a better mapping of reality. So I think because of that, there is some quote unquote randomness effect going into play. But then, like you said, the big question is, what do you mean? Like, what is the randomness? And something that I tend to believe in intuitively, which I don't have objective proof for, but which is my belief, which is somewhat different than Sam Harris. I agree with him on the minutia. When you take pretty much any singular decision, you really couldn't have decided it any other way. But I also believe that there is a general striving that each of us has, that we want to do something, we want to become something, we want to reach some goal. We have our modus operandi, we have our way of being, and that this striving is what's most essential to us as humans. It's what some people describe of as your soul or your eternal essence or your Atman or whatever that is, and that there is some freedom in choosing that direction with which we strive. So I think all of the minutia of like all the little decisions we make is sort of a fatalistic result of whatever our striving is, like basically whatever our system is optimizing for. But I believe that whatever that general striving is, I feel like if anything, that is part of our freedom, and that freedom people have to different extents, but that all of those different sort of freedoms going together is what creates the realities that we have, and where those diverge on higher conscious planes, higher dimensional planes, is what creates the multiverse.
Yeah, I mean that's
That's the best way I can describe it, and it's really hard to obviously put this stuff to words,
yeah.
but that's what I
Yeah, it's
intuitively
hard.
believe.
Yeah, I would agree with you for the most part. Um, I think when you're talking about the people deciding, or free will, if we're talking about free will not existing, and it really is deterministic, I think this that people don't have agency and can't have agency for their own lives. It just means, you know, you still make decisions.
Yeah.
Um,
Like
so
stepping on
it's
someone's
still,
toe intentionally versus accidentally is a big difference. It says a lot more about you if you intentionally step on someone's toe than if you do it by accident. And if you get punished for stepping on the person's toe intentionally, that's going to that's going to change your behavior. You might think twice the next time you step on someone's toe. So I don't think it obliterates morality or the system of social law and order by saying that there's no free will. It's more just that we have to change the systems of the carrots and the sticks of society so that what people strive towards is more in line with what fits in with everyone else and what creates the greatest amount of conscious happiness as opposed to conscious suffering.
yeah. I will just reiterate your point on what it means for social law and order,
Yeah.
um, because if one of the biggest examples of this is, I'm blanking on his name, but the guy that was at the University of Texas bell tower and shot a whole bunch of people with a rifle.
Yeah.
Um, he wrote a note saying, "I feel weird. Please do an autopsy on me,"
Oh
basically,
yeah.
because he had a huge tumor in his brain, which was pushing up against some part of his brain. I think the amygdala, the emotional regulator, um, maybe something else. But anyways, it was pushing up against a very important and crucial part of his brain, and it was making him act erratically and violently. And this kind of points to the fact that we don't necessarily have that much control over
Yeah.
what's going on, and we should work on our social justice system, because these people can't necessarily make these decisions for themselves. If you have a tumor in your brain that's causing you to act violently, that's
Yeah.
not you consciously deciding to be violent. That's some sort of external force that is causing it.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it makes me think of when you were talking about that, it made me think of the Kavanaugh situation. I don't want to get too into it, but just the part where he says, "I worked my butt off to get into Yale," and it was all about how like he did this and he did that, and look how great he is. But it's like okay, like first of all, you came from a very blessed background. You came from a very good family. Your family probably instilled some values of work ethic in you. They probably got you to good schools, and you probably had some innate sense of ambition and some innate skills in that you were good at test taking and everything else. And because of your family, you probably had a good network of people from which to help you. And so, in that sense, was it really you choosing to work your butt off and go to Yale, or would you always have worked your butt off to go to Yale? And so I think
Hmm.
like it's we can't really say that that was him like that was his freedom to choose to do that and that he could have done otherwise. But on the flip
Hmm.
side, if you say like, okay, well then, his freedom to whatever happened 35 years ago with the, sexual assault of Christine Blasey Ford, which I tend to very much believe Dr. Ford, did he choose that also? And I would say, no, I don't think he did choose that. And not even because he was drunk, but more that he probably did not have situations in his life previously where when he tried to get something that and he couldn't get it, that he was penalized for it. He probably was pretty more or
Hmm.
less always able to get what he wanted. And because he didn't have that training and those, reaching, those boundaries basically that had been instilled from him, then that was just his brain of optimizing for something that was advantageous to him, but very detrimental to the other party. And
Yeah.
so I think with all court cases, it gets so emotional. And certainly, if someone does not have those right boundaries and the right self control, they should not be given high power. But to also to say that it was like their freedom to act in a certain way, I don't know if that's necessarily true. And it wouldn't really change much about our justice system other than I think there'd be more of a focus on rehabilitation versus just pure punishment because it would all be about
Hmm.
rewiring the person's brain so that they're a good member of society versus
Yeah,
like
and
penalizing them.
yeah, like you're saying, we focus on the rehab. We don't need to punish these people, but we also don't necessarily need people that have these predetermined issues
Yeah,
in
positions
whether
of
it's,
power.
yeah, in positions of power, or if it's a very, very violent person. We still don't want that person roaming the streets.
Yeah, yeah.
We shouldn't necessarily put them in a prison in that situation, which makes them
Like, yeah,
even worse
right.
people.
Like solitary confinement.
Yeah, so if we focus on rehabilitation and also make sure that we need to protect society from predetermined patterns, there's a good way for us to get around this. I'm not very optimistic about that actually being a thing because I think humans just have this innate hope for like retribution.
Yeah,
Um,
it's so wired
but
into us.
yeah, just it's so deep.
Well, because fear
Anyway,
of retribution is a good way to keep people in line.
it
So
is.
the knowledge that if you step on that guy's toe, he might punch you in the face, that keeps people from stepping on each other's toes. But
Yeah, we
if
just need a world where stepping on each other's toes is not a, it's not even desirable.
yeah, and we also need a world where, if there's a dog that gets angry and bites someone, is the right method to lock it in a cage by itself, feed it scraps, and kick it every once in a while? Like, what kind of dog do you think is going to come out of that cage after, 3 months of doing that? It's not going to be a
Hmm.
better dog than originally came in. If you want to truly rehabilitate and make them members of society, and I agree with you, some people are too far gone and they should not be roaming the streets at all. Lock them away, throw away the key. But I think for most people, it's a gray area, and we should focus more on rehabilitation. And we could do a whole episode on the future of prison system or crime and punishment or
We
retribution.
should.
Yeah, so we will do that. But anyways, let's get on to the final. So we talked about free will. Now let's talk about, does God exist? And then the next one is there life after death? So,
Yeah, we can
I'll-
kind of tie those together probably.
yeah. So, I mean, for me, whenever people say, does God exist or do you believe in God? I think, what do you mean by God? That's always like, because that's one question that I feel like people never really ask, but that is the fundamental question. Because when you think about it from the Christian context or any of the major Western religions, God is seen as this separate being that's sort of ruling over his kingdom from afar. So you imagine God up in the clouds, like looking down at earth, deciding what's going to happen. But that is a very monarchical view of God, and there's no real reason to think that that's what God is. And if you believe that God is omnipotent, that he's all powerful, then it seems like if he's all powerful, if he has all the power, then there cannot be something separate from him. God is instead just the amalgamation of all power, of all beings. So if you add up all the humans in the world, all the animals in the world, all the fish, all the atoms, all the rocks, all the inorganic, all the dark matter, if you add all of that up, that is God. So to have God be something that has any sort of preference whatsoever would not fully describe God, because you're basically, every word slices part of the cosmos to define it as separate from the rest of the cosmos. But if God is everything, then you cannot say a single word about what he is. You cannot say he's good or he's bad, or that he's a jealous God or a just God. You cannot say any of those things, because that would put him separate from the rest of the whole. So
Hmm.
when people say, is there God? Yeah, there is God. I'm God, you're God, we're all God. We're all part of God. But to think of him as something separate is flawed in my mind. It's very narrow.
Yeah. Yeah, I have a I'm very with you on this because when we talk about the Christian God, do I think there is some sort of humanoid God up in the clouds, pointing the direction of everything and, gets jealous and casts people to hell for not believing in him, even though that he gives them no evidence to believe, just a
Yeah.
lot of really crazy things. No, I don't think that's true. And like you're saying, what is the definition of God? Like I've never personally liked the word God. Um, like, even from like age, I don't know, 10 or 12, sitting in church with my family, kind of thing that it's kind of bullshit, I guess. Like what's going
Yeah.
on, like what's being taught there, it just seems so off. And then once I tried to actually become what is the true nature of reality, we realize how much we don't know, but we also realize that there's a lot of things going on that we can kind of describe. Um,
Yeah, I mean, I've heard it described as God is that which science cannot yet
yeah,
explain.
yeah, it's like that idiosyncratic thing that we have no idea. Like we can explain these things and these other things, but there's just
It's kind of a
this
cop out.
area. Yeah, yeah, and that's kind of why I don't like the word God, because you could think of God as just a a system of really complex, as the chaos and the randomness of reality, or not randomness, depending on,
Yeah,
whatever our
it's
definition of
right.
randomness is.
Right,
Just
it
what
is
basically
that.
that God is what is actually true minus what we know is what it seems like. to me.
Right. Well, that's, I would say that's what most people refer to when they refer to God, which is basically the mechanism for that which is not obvious, which we don't already know, like, oh yeah, that's why that happened. The mystery of life, the mystery of being. But I
Hmm.
think what God should be, as far as the definition, should be everything and something that you cannot describe at all. But anyways, we only have a few minutes left, so I want to get on to the rest of it. So, is there life after death?
Hmm.
So this one
I
again would depend on what you mean by life.
Yeah. Yeah, do you mean consciousness? Like, is there some sort of consciousness that extends? Does your consciousness merge with some sort of collective consciousness after death? Has
Yeah.
this life just been some sort of isolated bit of consciousness, and then it kind of goes with whatever universal consciousness is, and that even sounds a little mystical. Maybe there's nothing.
Yeah.
Maybe we just get born into this world, or we take a little slice of a universal consciousness. Yeah, there. I don't know. I'm starting to sound like an Eastern mysticist, but
Well,
um,
everything does once you get into it far enough, which shows how much the Eastern mystics have read. But I guess what I would say about is there life after death? I mean, when I was a kid and I would go to church and Sunday school, they made it seem like life after death was basically, oh, you go to sleep and you wake up and you still remember everything about your previous life. You remember all the people you met, and you get to be with all the people who have already died, and you get to be with God. And you're frolicking around in a very similar way to you are now on your happiest days. And to me, knowing what I know now, I cannot believe that that is the case. It's much more easy for me to believe that our consciousness lives on, but to believe that the self, the ego that we have built up throughout our life, all of our memories, all of our predilections, I cannot believe that that is continued. To me, it makes a lot more sense that when you die, your atoms, your molecules, and your consciousness, your soul, whatever that is, that gets dispersed throughout the cosmos. And maybe part of you, part of your atoms, part of your consciousness becomes part of a butterfly's atoms and consciousness. Part of your atoms, part of your consciousness becomes part of the earth and the soil. Part of it might become some other creature or inorganic
mhm.
creature. And that it's all sort of being recycled in this cyclical sense. But to think that you stay together as this inert self, I think is it's just not what I believe. Now,
Yeah.
the only caveat to that is again the many worlds theory, the fact that you have other selves that, if you believe in the many worlds theory, that are existing, maybe that didn't die in what that train accident or whatever it was. And so I think the fact that we are living now, in a sense, with the many worlds, means that we live forever. If you live for a moment, you live forever because there's only the eternal present. So in that sense, I do think
Oh,
that
that's an
we
interesting
live for
perspective.
yeah. So because
Hmm.
imagine there's some higher dimensional you that's out there that has gotten beyond the bounds of time. And it's probably not the you that doesn't like peas and that whatever, like you have your own little quirks. It's probably more the essence of you, the archetypal you, which probably is it might be what's common among all people or all people of a certain spirit. Or maybe, I have a similar personality to one of my dogs, but not the other. So maybe the archetype is both me and that one dog that has a similar spirit to me. And
Mm.
it's hard to grasp at, but I think in the traditional way of people think about life after death, where you just remember everything and you're hanging with your friends and it's just like old times, I cannot believe in that, but I can believe in other ways of thinking of the problem where we live forever because of the eternal now and the many worlds theory, and where even with the way that we typically think of the world, where we die and then something else happens, the series of cause and effect, even in that sense, I think we don't die completely because where our atoms and our consciousness is recycled back into the workings of nature and the workings of the cosmos.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I that sounds like it makes sense to me.
Cool. Well, then let's get on to the final question for today, and then we'll wrap up. So the final question is, what is the best moral system? So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. I mean, if you're not ready, I have my thoughts too.
Hmm. Yeah, go ahead
Yeah. So I
on
I
on that
tend
one.
to believe again, not such a big surprise, but I tend to also agree with Sam Harris on this point, which is that free speech as the highest value is the best moral system. Because all we have are our words. All we have to create a better society and a better world is for us to discuss the different ways that we could be doing things and then to choose the best from among those. I think anytime we inhibit speech, like with China or Russia or North Korea, those societies where they do not let people say what they mean, they do not let people report freely. I think that is going to lead to worse and worse societies and worse conscious states of being. Now, of course, there are some forms of speech that should not be allowed. For instance, if you knowingly spread misinformation, I do not think that is protected. So, because that's a form of manipulation that's not just you speaking your truth, it's you trying to deceive. So I would put free will or sorry, I would put free speech as the highest value in my society.
Okay. Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, to extend that a little bit, you could say that the best moral system is just discovery and finding what is true. Because I think what you said and scientific discovery are so intertwined, and they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. Like we need both. We need a system where finding the truth matters
Hmm.
and
Well,
find
but I don't know if that's like some people really care about finding the truth, but not all people. People in the Rust
yeah,
Belt don't care so much about that. They just want to have food on the table. They want to not be in a fight with their wife. They want their kids to love them. So I don't know if it's for all people. It's about finding the truth. I feel like, I guess to extend free speech for my moral system, it would be just maximizing human freedom in general,
mhm,
without it impinging on other people's freedom. So, maximizing all individual and collective human freedom to do whatever you want, to be your own demigod, to create your own worlds through VR, to have just choice over how you want to do things, but to not enforce your way of doing things on others at the same time.
yeah. Well, just to play devil's advocate, though, to use your argument, the if you have um, or, yeah, if free speech or maximizing freedom is the best moral system, I mean, there's a lot of people that also don't want that as a moral system. Like China does not want that
Right, right.
as a system. So I don't necessarily think it matters that people don't want it if the question is just what
What is the
would lead to
best
the
moral
ultimate.
system? Yeah.
So so yeah, I mean I still stand by I think
Seeking
it's
truth.
important to find what is true.
Yeah. I think that's
Um,
valid. Yeah.
but and that just kind of extends to everything. It kind of it because there's a lot of nuances to what is true. There's a lot of things that we can find that are inconvenient
Right.
that
Well,
are true.
I think also to play some devil's advocate for China, one thing that I believe is that there should be no not at fault penalties. And what I mean by that is, let's say you're in a situation where you're in a self-driving car and another car that's a manual car veers into your lane illegally Like let's say they like run a red light or something. And because there are more passengers in that other car that made the illegal maneuver, your car decides to crash into a wall, kill you just to save the other people. I think that is a bad scenario because you did not have any fault. And even though utilitarians would have you be killed, I think because they went against the rules, they should be the ones penalized. And I think in a similar sense, like that's pretty much the rule in China's philosophy, which is that if you don't fit into society and do what you are supposed to do, then you should be penalized. But if you do everything properly and you're not harming anything, you're not stirring up the pot, then you can have as great of a life within those boundaries as possible, and that way everything gets kept under control and everything is maybe not as good as it could be for any individual, but it's pretty all right for most of the people. So, yeah, there's definitely a give and a take between the maximum freedom for individuals, but also making sure everything works smoothly and people follow the rules.
Yeah, I mean, like everything in life, there are nuances to
Right.
these questions, and there's not necessarily a single answer. There's a lot of gray area and overlap between different moral systems that make sense given certain cases.
Totally. Awesome. Well, I think that brings us to the end of today's podcast. This has been the future of philosophy. Thank you all for
Talk
listening.
about what
And
has
we hope
happened,
to see you
what
next
is
time.
currently happening, and what will inevitably happen.
The past, the present, and the